A couple of weeks ago, I found myself in an agonizing situation. After surviving a near-fatal car crash, enduring a difficult surgery, and struggling through a painful recovery, the last thing I expected was to be treated like a mere tool to clean up my brother's mess. But that's exactly how my parents treated me. The accident was a traumatic event. Another car slammed into mine, sending it flipping over, and I was left with internal bleeding, 2 cracked ribs, and a fractured leg. I was told by the paramedics that I was lucky to be alive. I spent a week in the hospital, in immense physical and emotional pain. All I wanted was the comfort of my family, especially my parents. But instead of rushing to my side, they were entirely absent. During my stay, I received no calls, no visits, nothing from them. My brother, on the other hand, was receiving all the attention. I learned that while I was fighting for my life in the hospital, my parents had been attending his award ceremony. They were more focused on his achievement than on me, their own daughter, who had just survived a traumatic ordeal. The reality that I wasn't even worth a phone call was crushing. This behavior was nothing new. My brother had always been the golden child, and I had been left to deal with everything on my own. When I finally managed to get in touch with them, expressing my hurt and disappointment at their behavior, their response was dismissive. They argued that my brother's award was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and when I pointed out that they could have come to see me if they had cared enough, they simply shrugged it off. I was told it was pointless to visit me, while my brother was out there making the family proud. I wasn't surprised. My brother had always been their priority, while I had been constantly overlooked, even when I achieved my own successes. A week after that, my parents finally came to visit me, but it wasn't out of concern for my well-being. They arrived with fake smiles and bouquets, clearly wanting to get something off their chests. They were already on edge, and I could tell their minds were occupied by something else. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. My brother had been arrested for a massive fraud scheme. He had been siphoning money from his company by falsifying accounts, and it had all come crashing down. He was facing charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery, and now my parents were scrambling to save him. They had already spent a large portion of their money hiring attorneys for him, and now they needed my savings to help cover his bail. They turned to me for assistance, despite the fact that they had shown me so little care when I was in the hospital fighting for my life. The hypocrisy was staggering. My brother, who had always received their unwavering support, had once again gotten into trouble, and now they expected me to clean up his mess. I refused. Even if I had the money, I didn't know him, or them, anything. The way they had treated me, both in my time of need and throughout my life, had made their request impossible to accept. When I told them no, they immediately lashed out. They accused me of being selfish and vindictive, of punishing them for loving my brother more. They told me that I was being cold-hearted, and that family should always come first. I was beyond upset, but I held my ground. For once in my life, I felt like I was in control of the situation, and I wasn't about to let them manipulate me into doing something I didn't want to do. Since that day, my parents have barely spoken to me. I know they're angry, but I no longer care. I've spent so much of my life trying to win their approval, only to be repeatedly rejected. I'm done. I don't owe them anything. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital. I had hoped to return home and find some peace, but when I arrived at my apartment, I was met by my parents waiting outside. They had somehow learned the exact time of my discharge, and were already there, ready to continue their barrage of demands. They accused me of going too far by refusing to help my brother, and this time, they were furious. They didn't care that I was still recovering from a traumatic surgery. They only cared about their precious son and his legal troubles. They insisted that I step up and show the family that I wasn't a disappointment. To them, helping my brother was my only chance to prove that I belonged in the family. They said I was using this situation to get back at them for all the years they had ignored me. I could barely hold it together. It was as if they saw me as nothing more than a pawn in their efforts to fix my brother's mess. Their treatment of me over the years had been painful enough, but now they were telling me that I was cold-hearted for refusing to enable my brother's behavior. The confrontation reached a boiling point when my mother began crying. screaming at me that they had already lost one child. And now they were going to lose me too. My father's anger was palpable, and he kept accusing me of being self-centered and ungrateful. It was all I could do not to break down, but I stood firm. I told them that if they didn't leave, I would call the police. I wasn't about to let them guilt-trip me into giving them a single cent for my brother's bail. Reluctantly they left, but not without hurling a final insult my way. A few days after their visit, my brother's case made headlines. The fraud scheme was far bigger than anyone had anticipated. It turned out that my brother had been transferring business funds for over a year and laundering money through fake accounts. The police had discovered evidence of his involvement in a larger conspiracy to conceal embezzled funds. Now, in addition to fraud, my brother was facing charges of conspiracy and money laundering. His reputation was completely destroyed, and he was facing the very real possibility of years in prison. As if this wasn't enough, my parents' lives began to unravel. My father lost a significant client, and their efforts to downplay my brother's actions fell on deaf ears. They were in full panic mode, and once again they turned to me. They begged me to help them, claiming that they were under immense stress, and that this was their only hope to keep the family together. But by this point, I knew exactly what was going on. They had spent years prioritizing my brother and ignoring me. Now that his world was falling apart, they needed me to clean up his mess, and I refused. This whole experience has been a whirlwind of emotions. I feel a mix of anger, sadness, and frustration, but most of all, I feel liberated. For the first time in my life, I'm standing up for myself and not letting their manipulation control me. I'm done trying to win their approval. If that makes me the villain in their eyes, then so be it. I've had enough. I reached out and grabbed her wrist, my fingers digging into her flesh with a firm, unyielding grip. "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice rising with every word. "Where is the man who's been sneaking around in my marriage?" Her eyes widened, filled with fear, but she said nothing. I tightened my grip, and she winced. "Tell me," I yelled, my patience finally snapping. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can't or won't?" I asked, the fragile calmness I'd been forcing shattering into a deep, simmering rage. But I already knew the answer. I already knew where he was. A very helpful private investigator had provided me with all the answers I needed. I released her wrist abruptly, stepping away as though her touch burned me. "It doesn't matter anymore, Laura," I said, my voice cold and flat. "It doesn't matter if you tell me or not." Her face, pale and drawn, was a mask of fear and confusion as she watched me grab my jacket from the coat rack. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice a broken whisper. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the door and walked out, leaving her standing amidst the scattered roses on the floor, a ruined tableau of our shattered marriage. His name was Jake. I'd learned it from her phone records after weeks of digging through old emails, call logs, and text messages. Jake, the smooth-talking finance guy from her office. A man with a wife and 2 kids. The kind of man I despised, selfish, deceitful, a coward hiding behind a veneer of charm. His house was a modest suburban affair, the kind that screamed middle-class mediocrity. It was the perfect stage for the reckoning I was about to unleash. I parked down the street, my heart pounding, each beat fueled by the volcanic rage simmering beneath the surface. As I walked up to his front door, my hands trembled, not with fear, but with the anticipation of justice. I rang the doorbell, the sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. When he opened the door, his face was a mixture of confusion and mild annoyance. He wasn't expecting company. Dressed in a simple polo shirt and cargo shorts, he looked smug, almost dismissive. That expression alone felt like an insult. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone casual, bordering on bored. "You're Jake, right?" I said, my voice calm but edged with steel. "You work with Laura." His eyes widened, a flicker of recognition quickly replaced by fear. He tried to close the door, but I shoved it open, stepping inside. He stumbled backward. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling now. I shut the door behind me with deliberate finality. "You're the man sleeping with my wife," I said, taking a step forward. He backed away into the living room. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape. I laughed, a bitter hollow sound, Don't insult my intelligence. I know everything. He opened his mouth to protest, but I silenced him with a swift, hard punch to the face. His head snapped back, and he cried out in pain, collapsing onto the sofa. Blood trickled from his nose, staining his hands as he covered his face. The smell of fear clung to him, sour and sharp. You think you can waltz into another man's life, steal his wife, and walk away unscathed? I snarled. Did you ever think about her husband, Jake? Did you ever consider what it would feel like to be betrayed? I dragged him off the sofa as he flailed weakly, trying to push me away. Years of self-defense training kicked in, movements honed by muscle memory. I drove my knee into his gut, and he doubled over, gasping for air. Grabbing his head, I slammed it into the glass coffee table. The table shattered, shards embedding in his face. He howled in pain, a pitiful sound that barely stirred my sympathy. This isn't over, I growled, kicking him in the ribs. He cried out again, his body curling into a fetal position on the floor. I wanted him to feel the depth of my anguish, to understand the price of his deceit. When I finally stepped out of his house, leaving the door wide open, I didn't look back. Let the neighbors see. Let the world see what kind of man he truly was. When I returned home, the house was silent. Laura was gone. The roses she'd scattered earlier still lay on the floor, their vibrant petals a stark contrast to the emptiness that now filled the room. I felt no satisfaction, only a hollow ache in my chest. The next day, I boxed up her belongings with methodical detachment. It felt like clearing out a storage unit, rather than dismantling a shared life. Among the things I found was a half-empty bottle of jasmine air freshener, her favorite scent. I tossed it into the trash along with everything else. I put the house up for sale and moved into a small apartment. Laura tried to reach out through mutual friends, through emails, through every avenue she could find. I deleted her messages without reading them. There was no going back. The trust was gone, the love obliterated. I was done with her. Done with the lies, the pain, the betrayal. She had to live with the consequences of her actions, just as I had to live with mine.